Blood stained the letter in her trembling hands as Beatrice Garrett stared at the words that shattered her world into 1,000 jagged pieces. Her husband dead somewhere in Colorado from a mining accident that took 17 men to their graves and left her with nothing but 40 acres of unforgiving Nevada soil and debts she could not begin to comprehend. The August heat of 1883 pressed down on paradise like the weight of heaven itself, had grown too heavy for the sky to hold, and Beatrice stood in the doorway of the shabby cabin that William had promised would be their palace someday, looking out at land that stretched endlessly in every direction with sagebrush and hard-scrabbled dirt that seemed to mock her with its very existence. She was 22 years old, a widow with hands so small and soft that even holding the hoe William had left leaning against the porch made her palms ache with the promise of blisters she did not know how to prevent. The bank letter had given her 3 months to make a payment she could not afford, and the only way to earn anything at all was to work land that she had no idea how to tame. She had come west with William 2 years earlier, full of dreams spun from the silver threads of young love and the promises he had whispered against her hair on cold Pennsylvania nights. He had worked odd jobs while saving every penny for this land, this claim to something that was theirs alone, and she had believed in him with the fierce devotion that only the very young can muster. But William was gone now, buried in some mass grave outside of Denver, and Beatrice was alone with her grief and her ignorance in hands that had been made for piano keys and embroidery needles rather than the brutal work of farming. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles east, and she had met them only once, a suspicious family who looked at her city clothes with the kind of contempt that country people reserved for those they deemed too delicate for real life. She had no one to turn to, no family within 1,000 miles, and the small amount of money William had left was dwindling faster than water in the desert sun. She needed to plant winter wheat if she had any hope of having something to sell come spring, but she did not know when to plant it or how deep the seeds should go or whether the soil needed something she could not name to make anything grow in it at all. Beatrice set the letter down on the rough wooden table William had built with his own hands and walked outside into the merciless heat, squinting at the land that was supposed to have been her future. The well William had dug was good and deep, at least cold water that tasted of minerals and stone, and she had a few chickens that gave her eggs and a milk cow that she had somehow managed not to kill through her fumbling attempts at care. But 40 acres of land laughed at her efforts, and she knew with a sinking certainty that she was going to lose everything William had died trying to give her. She picked up the hoe with hands that were already raw from her clumsy attempts at clearing the rocky soil near the cabin, and walked toward the nearest field, determination and desperation warring in her chest. The sun beat down on her bonnet, and sweat soaked through her dress within minutes, but she lifted the hoe and brought it down against the earth with all the strength she possessed. The impact jarred her arms and shoulders, and the blade bounced off the hard-packed dirt with barely a scratch to show for her effort. She tried again and again, each attempt more futile than the last, until her arms shook and her hands burned and tears of frustration blurred her vision into watercolor streaks. "You are going to hurt yourself doing it that way." Beatrice spun around so fast she nearly fell, the hoe clattering from her grip as she pressed one hand to her racing heart. A man sat astride a large bay horse not 20 feet away, and she had no idea how long he had been watching her pathetic display. He was tall even sitting down, with broad shoulders and sun-darkened skin that spoke of years spent outdoors, and he wore the dust-covered clothes of someone who had been riding for days. A worn hat shadowed his face, but she could see dark hair and eyes that were studying her with an expression she could not quite read. "I did not hear you coming," she said, and hated how her voice shook with equal parts fear and exhaustion. "I know," he said simply, and swung down from his horse with the easy grace of someone who had spent more time in a saddle than on solid ground. "You were making enough noise to cover a whole cavalry. The soil here is too hard this time of year without water. You will break your back before you break the earth." He walked toward her slowly, as though approaching a skittish animal, and Beatrice found herself taking an involuntary step backward. He stopped immediately, raising both hands in a gesture of peace, and she saw that he wore a gun low on his hip with the casual familiarity of someone who knew how to use it but did not make a show of it. "I mean you no harm, madam," he said quietly. "I am James Hawthorne. I have been working cattle drives between here and Texas for the past 6 years, and I know this country well enough to recognize when someone needs help." "I do not need your help," Beatrice said automatically, though the words tasted like lies even as she spoke them. "I am managing just fine." James looked at her for a long moment, then glanced at the barren field with its single pathetic scar where her hoe had made contact, then back at her with eyes that held something that might have been sympathy but was too respectful to be pitying. "All right," he said simply. "I will just water my horse at your well if you do not mind, and then I will be on my way." He led his horse toward the well without waiting for her permission, and Beatrice stood frozen in the field, watching as he drew up a bucket of cool water and let the animal drink deeply. He moved with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to taking care of himself and his mount, and when the horse had drunk its fill, he filled the bucket again and drank deeply himself, water spilling down his chin and throat in a way that made Beatrice suddenly aware that she was staring at a strange man with an intensity that was not proper. She looked away quickly, her face heating with more than just the sun, and bent to retrieve the hoe from where it had fallen. When she straightened, James was standing beside his horse, one hand on the saddle as though preparing to mount, but his eyes were on the cabin and the land around it with an expression that had gone thoughtful. "This is the Garrett place," he said, and it was not a question. "I heard in town that William Garrett died in that Colorado mine collapse. I am sorry for your loss." The words, simple and sincere, hit Beatrice harder than she expected, and she had to blink rapidly to keep fresh tears from falling. "Thank you," she managed. "He was a good man." "He must have been to have earned a wife willing to break her back trying to work land she does not know how to farm," James said, and there was no mockery in his voice, only a quiet acknowledgement of something he recognized as courage, even if it was foolish courage. "I am learning," Beatrice said, lifting her chin with a pride she did not feel. James studied her for another long moment, then seemed to come to some internal decision. "The soil needs to be irrigated before you can work it," he said. "And you will need to break it with something heavier than that hoe. A plow would be best, but even a good pickaxe would serve better than what you have been using." "I do not have a plow," Beatrice admitted, the words bitter on her tongue. "William was going to buy one with his wages from Colorado." James nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something he had already suspected. "I have a plow," he said, "in storage in Carson City. I was on my way there now to collect my gear before heading south for the winter. I could bring it back here if you liked. Get your fields ready for planting." Beatrice stared at him, trying to understand what he was offering and why. "I cannot pay you," she said bluntly. "I have almost nothing, and what I do have needs to go toward the bank payment." "I did not ask for payment," James said, his voice mild. "Then why would you help me?" Beatrice demanded, suspicion rising sharp and sudden in her chest. She had learned young that men did not offer something for nothing, and the lessons her mother had taught her about the dangers women faced alone in the world rose up like specters between them. James met her eyes steadily, and his expression was so open and honest that it made her suspicious all over again simply because she could not believe anyone could be that genuine. "Because you need help," he said simply, "and because I can give it. I do not need any other reason than that." Beatrice wanted to refuse him, wanted to cling to her pride and her independence and her belief that she could manage on her own. But the reality of her situation pressed down on her like the August heat, and she knew that pride would not save her land or pay her debts. Still, she hesitated, torn between desperation and the fear of owing something to a stranger she did not know and had no reason to trust. "I will think about it," she said finally, which was as close to acceptance as she could manage. James nodded as though this was exactly what he had expected. "I will be back in 3 days," he said. "Whether you want my help or not, I will stop by to make sure you are all right. A woman alone out here is vulnerable, and William Garrett was a decent man from what I heard. I reckon he would want someone to check on his wife." He swung up into his saddle before Beatrice could formulate a response, tipped his hat to her with old-fashioned courtesy, and rode away toward the shimmering horizon, leaving her standing in the field with her inadequate hoe and her confusion, and a strange flutter in her chest that she told herself was simply relief at having someone acknowledge her impossible situation. 3 days later, Beatrice was attempting to repair a section of fence that the milk cow had broken through when she heard the sound of hoofbeats and a wagon creaking. She straightened, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun, and saw James Hawthorne approaching with a horse-drawn wagon loaded with equipment she could not quite make out from a distance. Her heart did a strange little jump that had nothing to do with surprise, and she wiped her dusty hands on her apron, suddenly aware of how she must look with her hair falling out of its pins, and her dress stained with dirt and cow manure. James pulled the wagon to a stop near the cabin and climbed down, moving with that same easy grace she remembered. "Afternoon, Mrs. Garrett," he said politely. "I brought the plow and some other things you might find useful." Beatrice walked toward him slowly, eyeing the wagon with a mixture of hope and wariness. "Mr. Hawthorne," she acknowledged, "I told you I could not pay you." "And I told you I was not asking for payment," James replied calmly. He began unloading the wagon, and Beatrice saw a heavy steel plow, several tools she did not recognize, bags of what might have been seed, and supplies that must have cost him a small fortune. "I also brought winter wheat seed," he continued as though she had not spoken, "and some books on farming that might help you understand what needs to be done and when." "Why are you doing this?" Beatrice asked, and her voice came out smaller and more uncertain than she intended. "You do not know me. You owe me nothing." James set down the bag he was carrying and turned to face her fully, and there was something in his expression that made her breath catch in her throat. "My mother died when I was 12, he said quietly. "Left my father with 4 children and a farm in Missouri that he did not know how to run without her. Neighbors came and helped us that first year, asked nothing in return, and it is the only reason we survived. My father always said that kindness was meant to be passed forward, not paid back, and I have lived my life by that principle. So that is why I am doing this, Mrs. Garrett, because someone helped my family when we needed it, and because I can." The simple honesty in his words disarmed her completely, and Beatrice felt something tight in her chest loosen just a fraction. "Beatrice," she said softly, "please call me Beatrice. Mrs. Garrett makes me feel about 100 years old." A smile flickered across James's face, transforming it from merely handsome to something that made her heart stutter in a way she had not felt since William had first courted her back in Pennsylvania. "Beatrice," he repeated, and her name in his low voice sounded like something precious. "Then you should call me James. Mr. Hawthorne makes me feel like my father." Over the next 2 weeks, James Hawthorne became as much a part of Beatrice's daily life as the sunrise and the Nevada wind. He arrived each morning just after dawn, worked until the sun began its descent toward the mountains, and then rode back to wherever he was staying in paradise without ever asking for so much as a glass of water, though Beatrice always insisted he take meals with her, because feeding him seemed like the least she could do in exchange for the miracle he was working on her land. He broke the soil with a strength and skill that left her awed, irrigating sections with water from the well, and then working the earth until it was soft enough to receive seed. He repaired her fences properly, showed her how to care for her animals more efficiently, and fixed a dozen things around the cabin that she had not even realized were broken. He worked with a quiet intensity that spoke of someone who found peace in physical labor, and he never once made her feel foolish for her ignorance or helpless because of her small hands and limited strength. Instead, he taught her. Patiently and thoroughly, he explained what he was doing and why, showing her techniques for working smarter rather than harder, teaching her to read the land and the sky and the subtle signs that would tell her when to plant and when to harvest. He gave her the books he had purchased and spent evenings sitting on her porch, explaining passages she did not understand and answering her endless questions with a patience that seemed inexhaustible. "You are a good teacher," Beatrice said one evening as they sat watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and gold that seemed impossible, like God had decided to show off a little for an audience of 2. They had finished planting the last of the winter wheat that afternoon, and Beatrice felt something that might have been hope taking root in her chest, alongside the exhaustion that had settled into her bones. "You are a good student," James replied, taking a sip from the coffee she had learned to make strong the way he liked it. "Quick to learn and not afraid to ask questions when you do not understand. Those are rare qualities." "I think you are just being kind," Beatrice said, but she smiled as she said it, and James smiled back in a way that made the evening seem warmer despite the chill creeping into the desert air as autumn approached. "I am being honest," James corrected gently. "William was a lucky man to have you." The mention of her dead husband should have brought grief rushing back, but instead Beatrice felt only a distant sadness, as though William belonged to a different life that she had lived a long time ago. The guilt that followed that realization made her look away from James's steady gaze, and she wrapped her arms around herself despite the warmth. "You must miss him terribly," James said quietly, and there was no expectation in his voice, only an invitation to talk if she wanted to. "I do," Beatrice said slowly, picking her words with care. "But not the way I thought I would. William and I married young and we loved each other, but it was a practical kind of love, built on shared dreams rather than deep understanding. We were partners in building a life, but I do not know if we were ever truly friends. Does that make me a terrible person?" "It makes you honest," James said. "And it makes you someone who understands that love comes in different forms, not all of them equal. There is nothing wrong with that." They sat in silence for a while, and Beatrice found herself studying James in the fading light, noticing things she had been too busy or too determined not to notice before. The way his hands, scarred and calloused from years of hard work, were gentle when he handled tools or animals. The way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, suggesting he laughed more often than he frowned. The way he moved through the world with a quiet confidence that had nothing to do with arrogance and everything to do with a man who knew exactly who he was and felt no need to prove it to anyone. "What about you?" Beatrice asked impulsively. "Why are you not married with a family of your own instead of drifting from cattle drive to cattle drive?" James was quiet for so long that Beatrice thought he might not answer, and she was about to apologize for being too personal when he finally spoke. "I was engaged once," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Girl I grew up with back in Missouri. Sweet and pretty and everything a man should want. But when I told her I wanted to come west, she gave me an ultimatum. Stay in Missouri and live the life she wanted, or leave and lose her. I chose to leave." "Do you regret it?" Beatrice asked softly. "Not for a single moment," James said, and there was conviction in his voice that left no room for doubt. "I loved her, or thought I did, but I realized that she loved the idea of who she wanted me to be more than she loved who I actually was. Real love does not ask you to cut off pieces of yourself to fit into someone else's design. Real love takes you as you are and says that is enough." His words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning that Beatrice was not quite ready to examine too closely, and she found herself suddenly nervous in a way that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with the awareness that something was shifting between them, something that felt inevitable and terrifying and exhilarating all at once. "I should go," James said, standing and settling his hat on his head. "Early start tomorrow if we are going to get that irrigation system working the way it should." "James," Beatrice said, standing as well, and he turned to look at her with those steady eyes that seemed to see right through all her defenses. "Thank you for everything. I do not know how I can ever repay you." "You do not need to repay me," James said, and his voice had gone soft in a way that made her shiver. "Watching you learn and grow stronger every day is payment enough." He left before she could respond, riding off into the gathering darkness, and Beatrice stood on the porch long after he had disappeared, her hand pressed to her heart as though she could slow its racing by force of will alone. The weeks that followed fell into a pattern that felt both comfortable and charged with an undercurrent of something neither of them acknowledged directly. James continued to come every day, and the work on the farm progressed in ways that left Beatrice amazed at what could be accomplished when someone actually knew what they were doing. The winter wheat sprouted in neat green rows that looked like a miracle against the brown earth. The animals grew fat and healthy under proper care, and the cabin began to feel less like a drafty reminder of broken dreams and more like an actual home. But more than the physical changes to the land, Beatrice felt herself changing in ways that were harder to quantify but no less profound. She grew stronger, both in body and spirit, as the work toughened her hands and the success built her confidence. She learned to read the weather and the land, to anticipate problems before they became disasters, and to take pride in her own competence in a way she never had when she defined herself only through William's dreams. And through it all, she grew to know James in the way that only shared work and shared silence can teach you about another person. She learned that he was unfailingly patient except when dealing with injustice, that he had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard and made her laugh in ways she had almost forgotten she could. She learned that he had educated himself through years of reading every book he could get his hands on, that he could quote poetry and philosophy alongside practical farming advice. She learned that he was kind without being soft, strong without being cruel, and that he looked at her sometimes with an expression that made her feel like she was the only woman in the entire world. It was late October when everything changed. James had been helping her prepare the cabin for winter, sealing gaps in the walls and checking the roof for leaks, when a sudden storm rolled in from the mountains with the kind of violence that the desert could unleash without warning. Lightning split the sky in jagged white scars, thunder shook the ground, and rain came down in sheets that turned the world into a gray blur. "You cannot ride back to town in this," Beatrice said, watching the storm through the window with wide eyes. She had never seen weather like this, and the ferocity of it frightened her in a primal way that had nothing to do with rational thought. "I have ridden through worse," James said, but he was frowning at the storm in a way that suggested he was not entirely confident in that assessment. "Please do not," Beatrice said, turning to face him, and she did not care that her voice came out pleading. "The road will be a river by now, and it is already getting dark. Stay here tonight. There is room, and I would never forgive myself if something happened to you because I was too proper to offer shelter." James looked at her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his eyes, but finally he nodded. "All right," he said quietly. "Thank you." They spent the evening in the kind of domestic intimacy that Beatrice had not shared with anyone since William died, cooking dinner together in the small kitchen, eating by lamplight while the storm raged outside, and then sitting by the fire James built in the fireplace to ward off the chill that the rain had brought with it. They talked about everything and nothing, and Beatrice found herself telling him things she had never told another living soul, fears and hopes and dreams that she had kept locked away, because there had been no one who would understand them. "I was so angry at William when he died," she admitted, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "So furious that he left me alone with nothing but debt and land I did not know how to work. I felt guilty for being angry because he did not choose to die, but I could not help feeling like he had abandoned me anyway. Is that terrible of me?" "It is human of you," James said gently. He was sitting beside her on the worn settee that had come with the cabin, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, and his presence was more comforting than any fire could be. "Grief is not a simple thing, and anger is part of it. You are allowed to feel whatever you feel without needing to justify it or feel guilty about it." "You always know exactly what to say," Beatrice said, and she turned to look at him, really look at him, at this man who had appeared in her life like some kind of answer to a prayer she had not known she was praying. "How do you do that?" "I do not," James said, and his voice had gone rough in a way that made something low in her belly tighten with awareness. "Most of the time I have no idea what I am doing or saying. I just know that when I am with you, I want to say the right things. I want to make things easier for you. I want to see you smile, because your smile feels like sunshine breaking through clouds." Beatrice stopped breathing, caught in the intensity of his gaze, and the air between them seemed to thicken with possibility and want, and the kind of longing that had been building for weeks without either of them acknowledging it. "James," she whispered, and his name was a question and an invitation and a plea all at once. "I am falling in love with you," James said, and the words were simple and devastating and perfect. "I have been falling in love with you since the day I saw you trying to break that ground with a hoe and determination, and I do not know how to stop, and I do not want to stop. But I need you to know that I will never ask you for anything you are not ready to give. I will never push or expect or demand. I just needed to tell you the truth, because keeping it inside was becoming harder than facing whatever your answer might be." Beatrice felt tears spilling down her cheeks, but they were not tears of sadness or grief or fear. They were tears of relief and joy and the overwhelming realization that somewhere in the midst of loss and struggle, she had found something infinitely precious without even realizing she was looking for it. "I am falling in love with you too," she said, and her voice broke on the words, but they came out clear enough for him to hear, clear enough for the truth of them to fill the space between them like a living thing. "I did not want to." I felt guilty and disloyal, and like I was betraying William's memory. But I cannot help it. You have been so good to me, so kind and patient and generous, and somewhere along the way you stopped being a stranger who was helping me and became the person I looked forward to seeing every morning. You became the person who made me believe I could have a future instead of just survival. James reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and cupped her face in his work-roughened hands with a tenderness that made her heart ache. "May I kiss you?" he asked, and the fact that he asked rather than simply taking made her love him even more fiercely. "Yes," Beatrice breathed, and then his lips were on hers, gentle and questioning at first, then deeper and more certain as she kissed him back with all the pent-up longing and hope and desperate need that had been building inside her like a dam about to break. The kiss lasted an eternity and ended too soon, and when they finally pulled apart, Beatrice was trembling and James was looking at her like she was something miraculous that he could not quite believe was real. "Stay with me," Beatrice said, and she meant more than just the night, more than just the storm, and James understood because he nodded and kissed her again and murmured against her lips that he was not going anywhere, that he would stay as long as she wanted him, which she knew with bone-deep certainty was going to be forever. They spent the night wrapped in each other's arms on the narrow bed that had been hers and William's, and Beatrice felt no guilt, only the rightness of James's body against hers, and the sweet ache of being loved by someone who saw all of her, the broken pieces and the strong ones, and loved her not despite them but because of them. They made love with a passion that surprised her, and a tenderness that made her cry, and afterward they lay tangled together while the storm gradually spent itself outside, and the world became quiet except for their breathing and the beating of their hearts. "Marry me," James said into the darkness, his voice rough with emotion and exhaustion and hope. "Not today or tomorrow, but when you are ready. Marry me and let me spend the rest of my life making you happy." "Yes," Beatrice said, and it was the easiest answer she had ever given. "Yes, I will marry you, James Hawthorne, and I do not need time to be ready because I am ready now. I am ready to start living again instead of just surviving, and I want to do that with you." James tightened his arms around her, and Beatrice felt him press a kiss to the top of her head, and she knew with the kind of certainty that needed no proof that this was what real love felt like, the kind that asked nothing but gave everything, the kind that made you stronger rather than smaller, the kind that felt like coming home. They were married 3 weeks later in a small church in Paradise, with only the minister and his wife as witnesses, because neither of them had family nearby and neither of them wanted to wait any longer than necessary. Beatrice wore a simple blue dress that James said made her eyes look like the sky after a storm, and James wore his best clothes, which were still dusty and worn but clean. And when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, James kissed her with a joy that was infectious and a love that was unmistakable. They spent their wedding night in the cabin that was now truly theirs, both of them, and they made love with a freedom that came from knowing they had forever to learn each other's bodies and hearts and dreams. Afterwards, as they lay together in the darkness with Beatrice's head on James's chest and his hand stroking her hair, she felt a contentment so complete that it frightened her a little because she had not known it was possible to feel this happy after so much loss. "What are you thinking?" James asked softly, and Beatrice smiled against his skin. "I am thinking that I do not deserve you," she said honestly. "I am thinking that I got impossibly lucky when you rode into my life. I am thinking that I love you so much it feels like my heart is going to burst." "You deserve everything good in this world," James said fiercely, tilting her chin up so she had to meet his eyes even in the darkness. "And I am the lucky one. You are the strongest, bravest, most remarkable woman I have ever known, and I am going to spend every day of my life making sure you never forget it." "I love you," Beatrice whispered, and James kissed her again, slow and deep and full of promise. The winter that followed was hard in the way that Nevada winters could be, with cold that cut through clothing and wind that howled across the open land like something alive and angry. But the cabin was warm, the animals were well fed and sheltered, and the winter wheat lay dormant beneath the frozen earth, waiting for spring to coax it back to life. James and Beatrice spent the long winter nights talking and reading and making love, and the days working together to maintain the farm and prepare for the spring planting that would determine whether they could make the bank payment that still loomed over them like a threat. James was a partner in every sense of the word, never making decisions without consulting her, never treating her like she was incapable or fragile even though her hands were still smaller than his and her strength still less. He taught her everything he knew about farming and ranching, about reading weather patterns and market trends, about when to take risks and when to play it safe. And Beatrice learned with an eagerness that surprised them both, discovering that she had a natural aptitude for the business side of farming that complemented James's practical skills perfectly. "We make a good team," James said one evening in February as they pored over account books by lamplight, trying to calculate how much they could expect to make if the wheat crop was good and the prices held. "You have a head for numbers that I have never had. And you have knowledge and skills that would have taken me years to learn on my own, if I ever learned them at all," Beatrice replied, leaning against his shoulder in a way that had become as natural as breathing. "We balance each other." "We do," James agreed, kissing the top of her head in the casual way he had developed, as though he could not help touching her whenever she was near. "In every way that matters." Spring came slowly to Nevada, creeping in on the edges of winter storms until finally the days grew longer and warmer, and the wheat began to push up through the soil in green shoots that made Beatrice want to cry with relief. The crop was good, better than good, and when they harvested it in early June, they had enough to not only make the bank payment, but to have money left over for improvements and supplies, and maybe even a little bit saved for emergencies. The day they paid off the bank note, Beatrice cried tears of joy and relief, and James held her while she shook with the force of emotions too big to contain. "We did it," she said against his chest. "We actually did it. The farm is ours free and clear." "You did it," James corrected gently. "You were the one who refused to give up. You were the one who learned and worked and fought for this. I just helped." "You did not just help," Beatrice said fiercely, pulling back to look at him with eyes that were still wet but blazing with conviction. "You saved me and this farm. You asked nothing in return, but you gave me everything. Everything I have, everything I am, I owe to you." "You owe me nothing," James said, cupping her face in his hands and kissing her softly. "You earned this with your own strength and determination. I am just grateful I got to be part of it." Over the next 3 years, the farm prospered in ways that neither of them had dared to dream. They added more land, bought cattle and horses, and built a proper house to replace the shabby cabin, though Beatrice insisted they keep the cabin as a reminder of where they had started and how far they had come. James proved to be as skilled at ranching as he was at farming, and Beatrice discovered that she loved working with the horses, breeding and training them in ways that brought an income that supplemented the crops. But more than the financial success, their marriage deepened and strengthened in ways that Beatrice knew were rare and precious. They laughed together and worked together, and fought occasionally with the kind of passionate intensity that came from two strong-willed people, learning to navigate life as a team. and they loved each other with a fierceness that only grew stronger with time, finding new ways to surprise and delight each other, new depths to explore in the physical and emotional intimacy they shared. It was late summer of 1886 when Beatrice realized she was pregnant, and the joy that flooded through her was immediately followed by a fear that took her breath away. She had seen too many women die in childbirth, had attended too many funerals for babies who never drew breath, and the thought of losing James after she had only just found him, or of James losing her, was almost too much to bear. "What is wrong?" James asked one evening when he found her standing by the window, staring out at the land without seeing it, one hand pressed to her still flat stomach. "Are you ill?" "I am pregnant," Beatrice said, turning to face him, and she saw her own fear reflected back at her in his eyes for just a moment before joy overtook it. "That is wonderful," James said, crossing to her and pulling her into his arms. "That is the best news I could imagine." "I am frightened," Beatrice admitted, her voice breaking. "I am so frightened, James. What if something goes wrong? What if I die and leave you alone the way William left me? What if the baby does not survive?" "Then we will face it together," James said firmly, pulling back just enough to look into her eyes with an intensity that demanded she believe him. "Whatever happens, we will face it together. But you are strong, Beatrice, stronger than you know, and I have faith that you and our child are going to be just fine. I have to believe that because the alternative is not something I can allow myself to think about." Beatrice clung to him, drawing strength from his certainty even as her own faith wavered. And eventually her fear receded enough that she could feel the joy trying to break through. "We are going to have a baby," she whispered, and James laughed, a sound of pure happiness that made her smile despite her lingering anxiety. "We are going to have a baby," he agreed, and kissed her with a tenderness that made her believe, at least for that moment, that everything was going to be all right. The pregnancy was not easy, though Beatrice tried not to complain because James worried enough for both of them. She was sick for the first 3 months, exhausted for the next 3, and uncomfortable for the final 3. But through it all, James was patient and attentive, and so loving, that she sometimes felt guilty for not appreciating it more through the fog of physical misery. He took over most of the heavy work without being asked, hired a woman from town to help with the household tasks when Beatrice grew too large and awkward to manage them herself, and spent every evening reading to her from books and newspapers, trying to keep her entertained through the long months of waiting. Their son was born in March of 1887, during a spring storm that seemed fitting somehow, as though the weather was celebrating with the same wild intensity that Beatrice felt as she pushed and screamed and finally heard the thin wail that meant her baby was alive and breathing. James had stayed with her through the birth, despite the midwife's protests, holding her hand and murmuring encouragement. And when the midwife finally placed their son in Beatrice's arms, she looked up to see tears streaming down James's face unchecked. "He is perfect," James said hoarsely, reaching out to touch the baby's tiny hand with one finger, and the infant's fingers wrapped around it instinctively in a grip that Beatrice knew had just stolen her husband's heart completely. "He is absolutely perfect. What should we name him?" Beatrice asked, exhausted and exhilarated and more in love with her husband than she had known it was possible to be as she watched him fall in love with their son. "Thomas," James said immediately. "After my father, Thomas William Hawthorne, if you want to honor your first husband." Beatrice thought about it for a moment, then shook her head slowly. "Just Thomas," she said softly. "Thomas James Hawthorne. William is the past. You are my present and my future, and our son should carry your name, not the name of someone who never got the chance to be his father." James kissed her then, carefully because she was holding the baby, and there was such love in his eyes that Beatrice felt her own tears start to fall. "I love you," he said against her lips. "I love you so much, Beatrice. Thank you for giving me this, for giving me a family and a home and a reason to be grateful every single day that I decided to stop at your land that afternoon." "I am the one who should be thanking you," Beatrice said. But James shook his head and kissed her again, and they sat together in the aftermath of birth and the beginning of their life as parents, both of them understanding without words that something profound had shifted, that they were not just husband and wife anymore, but a family with responsibilities and hopes and fears that bound them together even more tightly than their love. Over the next year, Beatrice discovered that motherhood was harder than she had imagined and more rewarding than she could have dreamed. Thomas was a healthy baby but demanding, and there were nights when she and James took turns walking the floor with him, so exhausted they could barely think straight, and days when she wondered if she would ever feel like herself again. But there were also moments of pure magic, like the first time Thomas smiled at her, or the first time he laughed at something James did, or the evenings when they would sit together as a family and Beatrice would feel such contentment that it almost frightened her because she had learned too well that happiness could be snatched away without warning. But the years passed, and happiness was not snatched away. The farm continued to prosper, and they became known throughout Nevada as a couple who worked hard and dealt fairly, and never turned away someone who needed help. James, in particular, developed a reputation for generosity, always willing to lend a hand or share his knowledge, and Beatrice realized that he was passing forward the kindness that had been shown to his family in a way that honored his father's memory and created a legacy of goodness that would outlast them both. When Thomas was 3, they had a daughter they named Grace, and 2 years after that, another son they named Samuel. The house filled with noise and laughter, and the chaos that came with young children, and Beatrice often found herself standing back and watching her family with a sense of wonder that never quite faded. This was the life she had never known she wanted, the life that had been built out of loss and desperation, and the unexpected kindness of a cowboy who had asked nothing in return and given her everything. It was a warm evening in May of 1893, 10 years after James had first appeared in her life, when Beatrice found herself standing on the porch of their home, watching the sun set over land that they had tamed and nurtured, and made productive through years of hard work and dedication. Thomas was 9 now, Grace was 6, and Samuel was 4, and all 3 of them were playing in the yard under James's watchful eye, their laughter carrying on the evening air like music. James looked up and caught her watching, and he said something to the children that made them giggle, before walking toward the porch with that easy stride that still made her heart beat a little faster, even after 10 years of marriage. He climbed the steps and wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on the top of her head, and they stood together in comfortable silence, watching their children play. "What are you thinking about?" James asked eventually, and Beatrice smiled because he always wanted to know what was in her head, always treated her thoughts and opinions as valuable and worth hearing. "I am thinking about the day you first came here," Beatrice said softly. "About how lost and desperate I was, and how you saved me without even knowing me. I am thinking about how my hands were too small to work the land, and you did it for me, and asked nothing in return. I am thinking about how that one act of kindness changed my entire life." "I did not save you," James said, tightening his arms around her. "You saved yourself. I just helped clear the way." "We saved each other," Beatrice said, turning in his arms so she could look up at him, at this man who had become the center of her world, the foundation of everything good in her life. "I could not have done any of this without you, And I do not just mean the farm or the children or the material success. I mean becoming the person I am now, strong and capable and confident. You gave me that, James. You saw something in me that I did not even know was there, and you nurtured it the same way we nurtured this land. You asked nothing in return, but you gave me everything that matters. I love you, James said simply, and kissed her with the kind of passion that had not diminished over the years but had only deepened, becoming richer and more textured with the weight of shared history and shared dreams. I will always love you, Beatrice, until my last breath and beyond. And I will always love you, Beatrice promised, kissing him back with all the fierce devotion that 10 years of marriage had only made stronger. Forever and always, James Hawthorne, forever and always. They stood wrapped in each other's arms as the sun slipped below the horizon, and the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, and Beatrice felt a peace so profound that it brought tears to her eyes. This was home, she thought. Not the land or the house, or even the success they had built together, but this feeling of being completely known and completely loved by someone who saw all of her and chose her anyway, every single day. This was what it meant to be truly saved, not from poverty or hardship, though James had saved her from those things too, but from loneliness and fear, and the belief that she was not strong enough to survive life's hardships. James had shown her that she was stronger than she knew, and in doing so, he had given her something more precious than gold or land or any material wealth. He had given her herself, whole and healed, and capable of loving with the kind of depth and passion that she had not known existed before he rode into her life on that hot August day in 1883. The children ran up onto the porch then, demanding their parents' attention with the beautiful selfishness of the young, and James and Beatrice separated reluctantly, turning to focus on their son and daughters, answering questions and settling disputes, and simply being present in the way that good parents were. But throughout the evening routine of dinner and baths and bedtime stories, Beatrice kept catching James's eye across rooms and over the children's heads, and every time she did, they would share a smile that was full of private meaning and shared memory, and the kind of love that was built not on grand gestures, but on 10,000 small moments of choosing each other over and over again. That night, after the children were finally asleep and the house was quiet, James and Beatrice made love with a sweetness that brought tears to her eyes, and afterward, as they lay tangled together in their bed, Beatrice traced the scars on James's hands, the physical evidence of years of hard work, and felt such gratitude for this man that it overwhelmed her. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness, and James stirred, his hand coming up to stroke her hair. "For what?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep and satisfaction. "For everything," Beatrice said simply. "For seeing me when I was invisible, for helping me when you had no reason to. For loving me when I did not know I needed to be loved. For giving me this life, this family, this happiness. For asking nothing in return and giving me everything anyway." "You already thanked me," James said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "Every day for 10 years, you have thanked me with your love and your partnership and your faith in me. You have given me a home and a family and a purpose that I never had when I was drifting from place to place with no roots and no real future. You saved me just as much as I saved you, Beatrice. Maybe more." "Then we are even," Beatrice said, snuggling closer to him, feeling his arms tighten around her automatically, and she closed her eyes, feeling safe and loved and complete in a way that would have seemed impossible to the desperate young widow she had been 10 years ago. "We are even," James agreed, and kissed the top of her head, and they fell asleep wrapped around each other. Two people who had started as strangers and become something far more precious. Two halves of a whole that made sense only when they were together. The years continued to pass, marked by the changing of seasons and the growth of their children and the steady accumulation of memories that made up a life well lived. There were hard times still, because no life was free from difficulty, but they faced every challenge together with the unshakable certainty that whatever came, they could handle it as long as they had each other. The farm expanded until they were one of the most successful operations in Nevada, employing several hands and becoming known for the quality of their horses and the reliability of their crops. But for all their material success, what Beatrice treasured most were the small moments that made up their daily life. James still brought her coffee every morning, made exactly the way she liked it. She still mended his clothes and made sure his favorite foods appeared on the table with regularity. They still sat on the porch most evenings, watching the sunset and talking about everything and nothing, finding in each other the kind of companionship that needed no entertainment beyond simple presence. Their children grew strong and healthy, Thomas inheriting his father's quiet strength and practical nature, Grace getting her mother's quick mind and her father's kind heart, and Samuel proving to be a perfect blend of both parents with a mischievous streak that kept them all on their toes. They were good children, not perfect but loving and respectful, and Beatrice knew that the example she and James set of what love should look like would shape how her children approached their own relationship someday. On their 15th wedding anniversary, James surprised Beatrice with a piano, the same kind she had played as a girl back in Pennsylvania, and when she sat down at it and ran her fingers over the keys, she wept with the bittersweet realization that she was not that girl anymore, had not been that girl for a very long time, but that the woman she had become was someone she was proud to be. She played for hours that day while James listened with his eyes closed and a smile on his face, and when she finally stopped, he told her that she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and she believed him because James had never lied to her, not once in 15 years. "Do you ever regret it?" Beatrice asked him later that night as they lay in bed, her head on his chest and his hand playing with her hair in the absent way he had when he was content. Taking on a widow you did not know and a farm that was failing. You could have had an easier life if you had just kept riding that day. "Never," James said immediately, and there was such conviction in his voice that it left no room for doubt. "Not for a single second have I regretted choosing to help you. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Beatrice. You and our children and this life we built together. Every good thing I have comes from the decision I made to stop and offer you help. How could I possibly regret the best decision I ever made?" Beatrice tilted her head up to kiss him, pouring into the kiss all the love and gratitude and devotion that 15 years together had only made stronger. And James kissed her back with equal passion, and they made love with the kind of familiarity that came from knowing each other's bodies as well as they knew their own, but with a freshness that came from never taking each other for granted, from always choosing to love actively rather than passively accepting love as their due. When Thomas turned 18 and announced that he wanted to start his own ranch on the far section of their land, Beatrice felt the bittersweet pang of watching her oldest child step into adulthood. But she was proud of the man he had become and grateful that he wanted to stay close rather than seeking his fortune elsewhere. James helped him build a cabin and stock it with everything he would need, and Beatrice found herself thinking about how her husband had helped her in exactly the same way all those years ago, asking nothing in return, simply giving because he could, and because it was the right thing to do. "You are passing it forward," she told James one evening as they watched Thomas ride toward his new home, and James smiled and nodded. "Just like my father taught me," he said. "Kindness is meant to be passed forward, not paid back." If Thomas learns that lesson and teaches it to his children someday, then we will have done something worthwhile with our lives." "We have already done something worthwhile," Beatrice said fiercely, taking his hand and squeezing it. "We built a life out of nothing. We loved each other and raised good children and created something lasting and valuable. That is more than worthwhile, James. That is extraordinary." When Beatrice turned 50, she realized with a sense of wonder that she had lived more years with James than without him, that he had been her husband longer than William ever was, and that every single day of those years had been a gift she never took for granted. They had been married for 25 years, had weathered every storm life threw at them, and had emerged stronger and more in love than ever. Their children were grown now. Thomas married with 2 children of his own, Grace teaching school in Carson City, but coming home every month to visit, and Samuel working the ranch with his father and showing every sign of taking over the operation someday. The house was quieter now without the constant noise of children, but Beatrice found that she did not mind because it meant more time alone with James, more evenings on the porch watching the sunset, more lazy mornings in bed before the demands of the day called them away. "We did good," James said one evening as they sat in their usual spots on the porch, rocking chairs creaking in comfortable rhythm. He was 62 now, his dark hair liberally streaked with gray, his face lined with years of sun and wind and laughter, but to Beatrice he was as handsome as the day she had first seen him. Maybe more so because now when she looked at him, she saw not just a handsome stranger but the accumulation of 25 years of love and partnership and shared life. "We did," Beatrice agreed, reaching over to take his hand, their fingers lacing together in a gesture so familiar it happened without thought. "We did better than good. We did extraordinary." "I love you," James said, turning to look at her with eyes that still held the same intensity they had held that first night when he told her he was falling in love with her. "I have loved you for 25 years, and I will love you for however many more years we have. You are my heart, Beatrice. My home, my everything. And you are mine," Beatrice said, and stood, tugging him up from his chair and into her arms, kissing him with all the passion of a young bride despite the gray in her hair and the lines on her face. "Forever and always, James Hawthorne, forever and always." They went inside as the sun set, leaving the porch empty but full of their presence, and in the house they had built together, surrounded by the memories of 25 years of marriage and the promise of however many more years they would be granted. They loved each other with a tenderness and passion that had only grown richer with time. Beatrice fell asleep that night wrapped in James's arms, feeling his steady heartbeat beneath her cheek, and she thought about the desperate young widow she had been, with hands too small to work the land and no idea how to save herself. She thought about the cowboy who had appeared like an answer to a prayer, who had worked her land and asked nothing in return, who had seen her struggling and simply helped because he could, because it was the right thing to do, because kindness was meant to be passed forward, not paid back. She thought about how that one act of generosity had changed the entire trajectory of her life, had given her not just a farm but a family, not just survival but a reason to thrive, not just a husband but a partner and a friend and the great love of her life. She thought about how lucky she was, how blessed, how grateful for every single day of the last 25 years. And as she drifted off to sleep, safe and warm and completely loved, Beatrice smiled, because she knew with absolute certainty that this was what happiness looked like, what love looked like, what a life well lived looked like. It looked like a cowboy who had stopped to help a stranger and had stayed to build a life with her. It looked like hands that had been too small to work the land learning to work it anyway with help from someone who asked nothing in return. It looked like two people who had started as strangers and become something far more precious, something eternal, something that would last long after they were gone, in the memories of their children and their children's children, a legacy of love passed forward just like the kindness that had started it all.